October 17, 1883. The air over the Dakota plains held the first true bite of winter, a clean, sharp cold that promised worse to come. Inside the grey walls of the Blackwood Orphanage for Girls, Mercy traced the outline of a sheep drawn in faded ink on brittle paper. The drawing was in her mother's book, a small leather-bound journal filled with a script that flowed like water over stones. It was the only thing she and her sister, Prudence, had of their parents. The book spoke of seasons and soil, of animal husbandry and root cellars, of a life tied to the turning of the earth. Mercy's finger, calloused from laundry lye and endless scrubbing, followed the curve of the animal's back. It was a creature of warmth and substance, a world away from the cold, thin blankets of the dormitory. Prudence stood at the window, her reflection a perfect mirror of Mercy's own face, watching the wind strip the last stubborn leaves from the cartonwood. They shared the same dark hair, the same steady grey eyes, the same quiet set to their mouths. But where Mercy's stillness was watchful, Prudence's was defiant. Today was their 18th birthday. It was not a day of celebration. It was a day of eviction. Some inheritances are not measured in acres, but in ink. Mrs. Gable, the matron of the orphanage, had made the announcement at breakfast, her voice as crisp and without warmth as the morning air. "You are women now," she had declared, placing a thin envelope on the table between their bowls of watery oatmeal. The county's charity has its limits. Inside was a pittance of coin, barely enough for a week's bread, and a folded, yellow deed. It was their parents' only worldly possession, left in the orphanage care along with 2 infant girls nearly 2 decades ago. The deed was for a plot of land 5 miles outside the town of Providence. Mr. Finch, the mercantile owner who also served as the town's unofficial notary, had laughed when he'd last seen the document. "That plot? It's worthless. All rock and ravine. Got a cave on it big enough to swallow a house, but you can't plow a cave." Mrs. Gable knew this. The deed was not a gift, it was a final, tidy dismissal. The town of Providence watched them go, 2 identical figures in worn grey dresses, each with a small bundle of belongings. They saw 2 orphans, turned out and destined for trouble or, at best, a hard life as hired help. They did not see the book tucked into Mercy's bundle, nor did they understand the steady, unified purpose in the sisters' stride. They walked not with the shuffle of the defeated, but with the deliberate pace of people who had a destination. The wind was cruel, but they leaned into it together, their shoulders almost touching. The journey took them past the last homestead, past the cleared fields now hard with frost, and into the broken country where the plains gave way to low, pine-stubbled hills. The entrance to the cave was a dark slash in a wall of grey rock, a gaping mouth that seemed to exhale a cold, ancient breath. It looked like an ending. Prudence, however, reached out and laid her hand flat against the stone beside the entrance. It was cold, but it was solid. It was real. "Well," she said, her voice steady against the wind. "We are home." They stepped across the threshold, out of the biting wind and into a sudden, profound stillness. The air inside was not warm, but it was not the piercing cold of the open prairie. It was the deep, neutral chill of the earth itself, unchanging and absolute. The cave was immense. Its mouth was wide enough for 3 men on horseback to ride in abreast, and it opened into a vast chamber whose ceiling vanished into darkness far above their heads. Sunlight penetrated only the first 50 feet, painting the dusty stone floor in a pale, ethereal light. Beyond that, the darkness was complete. Mercy lit the single lantern they owned, its small flame pushing back the gloom in a fragile, golden circle. The light slid over walls of rock that were smooth in some places, jagged in others, streaked with veins of white quartz that glittered like trapped stars. The ground underfoot was not soil but a fine, sandy dust mixed with stone. The only sound was the soft scuff of their boots and a faint, rhythmic dripping from somewhere deep within the cavern. They walked forward, their shadows dancing and stretching behind them. It was Prudence who found the source of the dripping. Tucked into a recess at the back of the main chamber, a steady trickle of clear, cold water seeped from a fissure in the rock, collecting in a shallow, stone-rimmed pool before vanishing into a crack in the floor. They knelt beside it. Mercy dipped her fingers in. The water was shockingly cold, but clean. She tasted it. It was pure. Mother's book, Mercy said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the cavern's great silence. It said to always look for water first. That water is the beginning of everything. Prudence nodded, her gaze sweeping the monumental space around them. It was not a home. It was a geological fact, a void in the earth. But it was shelter. It was defensible. And it had water. Therefore, it was possible. They spent that first night huddled together in their thin blankets, the lantern burning low between them. Outside, the wind howled its fury against the plains, a lonely and violent sound. Inside the cave, they heard only a distant, muffled sigh. The stone absorbed the storm. For the first time in their lives, they felt a strange and profound sense of security. They were not in a warm room behind a locked door, but they were held in the heart of the land itself. They were no longer subject to the whims of a matron or the charity of a town. Their survival now depended entirely on their own hands, their own minds, and the faded ink in their mother's book. Lying there in the dark, they did not speak of fear. They spoke of plans. They spoke of timber and soil, of seeds and stock. They spoke of building. The next morning, they began. Their first task was to create a home within the home, a space that could hold warmth and keep out the damp chill of the stone. The book had diagrams of simple cabins, designs that valued sturdiness over grace. The surrounding hills were dotted with lodgepole pine, tall and straight. Their only tool for felling them was a two-woman crosscut so they had purchased with their meager savings, its teeth freshly sharpened by the town blacksmith, who had looked at them with pity. He did not understand they were not buying a tool for cutting firewood, they were buying the tool that would build their world. The work was brutal. They were not large women, and their strength was one of endurance, not explosive power. They learned the rhythm of the saw, the steady push and pull that let the teeth do the work. Prudence on one end, Mercy on the other, they moved in a silent, perfect synchrony that had been honed over 18 years of shared existence. When one tired, the other pushed harder, a seamless transfer of energy. The pine tree groaned, resisted, and then surrendered with a great crack and a sigh of falling needles. They did not fell the trees closest to the cave, but selected them from a thicker stand a quarter-mile away, mindful of the ecosystem they now inhabited. Getting the logs to the cave was a challenge of leverage and patience. They used smaller logs as rollers and a system of ropes to drag the heavy timbers across the uneven ground. It took them a full day to move 3 logs. By evening, their hands were raw with blisters, their backs and shoulders a single, unified ache. But as they stood at the mouth of the cave, looking at the 3 felled pines lying on the ground, they felt not exhaustion, but a grim satisfaction. This was the foundation. While Mercy continued the slow work of felling and moving timber, Prudence turned her attention to the cabin site. They chose a level spot deep within the first great chamber, just at the edge of the sunlight's reach but far enough in to be completely protected from wind and rain. She cleared the ground of loose rock and dust, using a shovel to level the earth until it was a perfect, flat rectangle. Then, with twine, she marked the corners. She began to build the hearth first, knowing it was the heart of any home. She gathered flat, heavy stones from the scree field at the base of the hill, choosing them for size and stability. She had no mortar, but her mother's book described a technique using a thick, sticky clay dug from a creek bed and mixed with dry grass. She found the creek a half-mile away, its banks rich with the grey clay she needed. She carried it back in buckets, a heavy, spirit-sapping labor. She built the fireplace and chimney with painstaking care, fitting the stones together like a puzzle, packing every crevice with the clay mixture. It was slow, elemental work, the kind of labor that measured progress in inches, not feet. They spent a week felling and moving the logs they would need. During this time, they became aware of an occasional observer. A man, old and weathered, who watched them from the ridge line. He carried a long rifle and wore buckskins, moving through the trees with the silence of a ghost. He never approached, never spoke. He just watched. They learned he was Ansel, a trapper who lived alone in the hills and was regarded as half-wild by the people of Providence. They paid him no mind, too consumed by their work. Once they had enough logs, the real construction began. They had studied the drawings in the book until they knew them by heart. They would build a simple saddle-notch cabin. Using a sharp adze, they peeled the bark from the logs. Then came the most difficult part, squaring two sides of each log and cutting the notches. Prudence, with her steady hand and unwavering focus, did the marking and the fine carving with a chisel. Mercy, with her patient strength, did the rough work with the adze and saw. They worked as one unit. The first two logs were laid parallel on the foundation stones Prudence had set. Then they laid the next two logs across the ends, fitting the carved notches together. To lift the heavy timbers, they built a simple ramp of earth and smaller logs, rolling the great pines into place. It was a feat of engineering born of necessity. They were not strong enough to lift the logs, so they had to be smarter. The walls rose slowly, one course at a time. Each log was measured, hewn, notched, and rolled into place. It was a process that could not be rushed. A single mistake in a notch would compromise the entire structure. They spoke little, communicating mostly through gestures and shared understanding. The silence of the cave was broken only by the rhythmic scrape of the adze, the sharp tap of the chisel, and their steady breathing. As the walls grew higher, their small world began to take shape. It was a wooden island in a sea of stone. They chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of dried moss they gathered from the shaded side of the hill and the same creek-bed clay Prudence had used for the hearth. They packed it in tightly, creating a seal that would be impervious to the wind. The roof was the final challenge. They laid smaller logs across the top as rafters, then covered them with a thick layer of pine boughs. On top of the boughs, they layered wide strips of bark they had carefully peeled from the felled trees. Finally, they covered the entire roof with a thick layer of sod cut from the prairie. The living earth would provide insulation and hold everything in place. The day they finished, a month after they had first arrived, they stood inside their small, one-room cabin. It was not large, but it was solid. It smelled of raw pine and damp earth. They built their first fire in the stone hearth. The clay held, the chimney drew perfectly, and the smoke rose straight and true into the high darkness of the cave. They sat on the floor before the flames, watching the light flicker on the log walls, and for the first time, they allowed themselves a moment of rest. They had built a house inside a mountain. With the cabin built, their attention turned to food. Winter was no longer a promise, it was a presence, lurking in the ever-shorter days and the deepening frost that silvered the ground each morning. Their small cache of coins was dwindling, and they knew they could not rely on the town mercantile for their survival. They needed to create their own larder. The floor of the cave was stone and dust, useless for cultivation. But near the mouth, in the wide arc where the sun reached for a few precious hours each day, there was a possibility. Following a design from their mother's book for a kitchen garden, they decided to build raised beds. This was another monumental task. They constructed long, shallow wooden frames from the leftover pine scraps. Then, bucket by bucket, they hauled soil from the fertile banks of the creek. It was a journey of half a mile each way, and the buckets were heavy. They filled the beds with the dark, rich loam, mixing in dried leaves and other organic matter to enrich it. Their backs ached constantly, but they worked from sunrise to sunset, driven by the urgency of the coming cold. In the book, their mother had written about the plants of the high plains, the ones that were hardy and resilient. She wrote of kale that sweetened with the frost, of turnips and carrots that could be stored in sand through the winter, of potatoes that were a meal in themselves. They had saved seeds from the orphanage garden, secreted away over the years in small cloth pouches. They planted them with careful attention, spacing them just as the book instructed. The unique environment of the cave mouth offered an unexpected advantage. While the direct sunlight was limited, the great stone walls absorbed the heat of the day and radiated it back slowly through the night, creating a microclimate that was slightly warmer and more protected than the exposed fields of the town. The stone shielded the tender seedlings from the relentless wind. Their garden, nestled at the entrance to the deep earth, began to grow. To their immense relief, small green shoots soon pushed their way through the dark soil. It was a fragile miracle of green against a backdrop of grey stone. They tended it with a fierce devotion, watering it from the cave spring and pulling every weed. While the garden grew, they turned to the final piece of their plan: livestock. They needed a source of protein, milk, and wool that could sustain itself through the winter. The book was clear on this point: sheep were hardy, adaptable, and could survive on sparse forage. Chickens would provide a steady supply of eggs. With the last of their money, they walked into Providence. The townspeople watched them with a mixture of curiosity and scorn. Mr. Finch, the mercantile owner, was particularly dismissive. "Heard you two were living in a hole in the ground like coyotes," he said, a smirk on his face, as they bought a small bag of grain. "What do you need chicken feed for?" "Gonna raise them on rocks." Prudence met his gaze without flinching. "We will manage," she said, her voice even. They did not find any sheep for sale in the town. Disheartened, they were walking back toward the hills when a figure stepped out from the trees. It was Ansel, the old trapper. He had been watching them, not with the idle curiosity of the townsfolk, but with a keen, appraising eye. He had seen them fell the trees, build the cabin, and haul the soil. He had seen their silent, relentless labor. He didn't offer greetings or pleasantries. "You work," he stated. It was not a question. "We do," Mercy replied. "I have sheep," he said, gesturing back into the woods. "A small flock. They are more trouble than they're worth to me now. My hands are too stiff for the shearing." He looked at their hands, calloused and capable. "I need coats mended. I need jerky smoked. You have skill with a needle, I'd wager. And you have a place to keep a flock safe from the wind." It was a negotiation. He offered them a young ram and 2 healthy ewes in exchange for their labor, mending his winter clothes and preparing his meat for the season. He also gave them fur-laying hens and a rooster, throwing them in as part of the bargain. "Chickens are fools," he grumbled. But they agreed without hesitation. It was a transaction built on mutual respect for competence, a language the town did not speak. They led their small flock back to the cave, their hearts full of a hope that was as solid and real as the animals themselves. They built a pen for the sheep and a coop for the chickens in a smaller side chamber of the cave, deep inside where the temperature remained constant year-round, a cool 50 degrees no matter the season. The animals were protected from predators and the elements in a way no barn on the plains could ever match. They gathered dry grasses from the prairie before the first snows, stockpiling it for winter feed. The rhythm of their lives settled into a new pattern, dictated by the needs of their growing homestead. Mornings began before sunrise, with milking the ewes. The milk was rich and sweet, and they learned to make a simple, soft cheese from it. They fed the chickens and collected the precious eggs, each one a small treasure. They tended the garden, harvesting the hardy greens and root vegetables as they matured. They spent the days preparing for the winter their mother's book had taught them to respect. They smoked strips of mutton over a low, slow fire, following Ansel's instructions. They stored the carrots and turnips in wooden crates filled with sand from the cave floor. They braided onions and hung them from the cabin rafters. Nothing was wasted. Every part of their small world was interconnected. The chicken droppings fertilized the garden beds. The whey from the cheese was fed to the chickens. The ashes from their fire were used to control pests in the garden. It was a closed, self-sustaining system, a world of their own making. As the days grew shorter and colder, Prudence took on the task of shearing the sheep. Ansel had shown her how, his gnarled hands guiding hers. The wool was thick and oily. They washed it in the spring water, carded it with combs they bought in town, and Mercy, using a simple drop spindle her mother had described in the book, began to spin it into yarn. Her fingers, once raw from lye, were now nimble and sure. She spun for hours by the firelight, the soft whir of the spindle a comforting sound in the vast silence of the cave. The town of Providence prepared for winter in its own way. The ranchers brought their cattle in from the open range, confident in their large herds and ample hay. Mr. Finch boasted that his livestock was the finest in the county, sleek and fat. The townspeople stockpiled flour and coffee from the mercantile, secure in the knowledge that their larders were full. They saw the 2 sisters on their rare trips to town, buying salt or needles, and they shook their heads. The cave twins, they called them. They saw 2 thin, serious girls in homespun wool and imagined a miserable, hand-to-mouth existence. They could not conceive of the warmth of the cabin, the richness of the garden, or the steady, quiet abundance of the life the sisters had built within the earth. They saw poverty and strangeness, and they pitied them. But pity was an indulgence the sisters had no time for. They felt the air change. They saw the geese flying south in great, urgent formations. They watched the clouds, which now hung low and heavy, the color of slate. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a harbinger. Ansel stopped by one afternoon, leaving a bundle of cured pelts without a word. It was his way of saying goodbye until spring. He was heading for his winter cabin, higher in the hills. Before he left, he looked at their stockpile of wood, their preserved food, and the healthy sheen on their animals' coats. He simply nodded. "You will be fine," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. That night, the wind began to blow. It was a new sound, not the familiar prairie wind, but a high, keening shriek that seemed to come from the heart of the north. Mercy and Prudence brought the sheep and chickens into the deepest part of the cave and secured the doors to their pens. They checked the chinking on their cabin walls and added more wood to the fire. Then they sat and listened as the storm fell upon the world. The blizzard raged for 3 days without pause. It was a white hurricane, a storm that erased the world, burying fences, erasing roads, and scouring the landscape with ice crystals as sharp as sand. Inside the cave, the sisters were utterly insulated. They heard the storm only as a distant, mournful howl at the cave's mouth. The temperature in their cabin remained comfortable, the stone hearth radiating a steady warmth. They tended their animals, spun wool, and read from their mother's book by the light of the fire. Their life continued, orderly and calm, while outside, the world was being torn apart. When the storm finally broke, the silence it left behind was absolute and profound. The world was remade in white, buried under a deep, uniform blanket of snow. The sky was a brilliant, merciless blue, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. The town of Providence was completely isolated. No one could get in or out. The ranchers and homesteaders who lived on the plains were hit the hardest. The wind had driven the snow into immense drifts, burying barns and houses. The cattle, caught out in the fields or in poorly sealed barns, had no chance. The brutal combination of wind and cold was lethal. They froze where they stood, solid statues of hide and bone. Mr. Finch's prized herd was wiped out, a fortune in livestock lost in a single night. Even the animals in town were not spared. The cold was so intense that it penetrated the thickest barn walls. Chickens froze on their roosts. Hogs perished in their pens. The town's entire supply of fresh meat and eggs was gone. At first, the people of Providence relied on their pantries. They had flour, beans, and salted pork. But as the days turned into weeks, and the paralyzing cold refused to lift, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to creep into the town: fear. The salted meat ran out. The stores of potatoes and onions dwindled. A sickness, born of cold and poor nutrition, began to spread. Children grew thin and listless. The town, once so confident and self-sufficient, was starving. It was a rancher from the edge of town, a man named Peterson whose family was down to their last bag of flour, who first thought of the sisters. He remembered seeing them hauling soil, remembered the town's mockery. He wondered if, by some miracle, they had survived. Desperate, he and 2 other men put on snowshoes and began the grueling 5-mile trek to the cave. They expected to find the entrance buried, or worse, to find the frozen bodies of the 2 young women. They fought their way through massive drifts, the cold burning their lungs. It took them half a day to cover the distance. When they finally reached the ravine, they stopped and stared in disbelief. The cave mouth was open, sheltered from the worst of the drifting by the rock face. And from within, they could see the soft, impossible glow of a lantern and a thin, steady plume of smoke rising into the still air. The men approached the cave with a sense of dread and awe, like entering a tomb that showed signs of life. The sheer scale of the cavern silenced them. They saw the neatly stacked firewood, the carefully constructed garden beds now dormant under a protective layer of straw, and beyond them, the small, solid cabin with light in its window. It was an island of impossible order in a world of frozen chaos. Prudence met them at the cabin door, holding a lantern. She was not gaunt or desperate. Her cheeks had color, and her eyes were clear and direct. She showed no surprise at their presence. Behind her, Mercy stood in the warm, fire-lit room. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting turnips. The men, their beards crusted with ice, their faces chapped raw by the wind, could only stare. We heard the storm," Peterson stammered, his words clumsy. We didn't know the stone is good shelter," Prudence said simply. There was no accusation in her voice, only a statement of fact. "We are in trouble," another man confessed, his voice cracking. "The town. The livestock is gone. All of it. We are running out of food. The children." He couldn't finish. Mercy stepped forward. "Come inside," she said. "The fire is warm." They led the men into the cabin. It was small but immaculately kept. Hams and smoked mutton hung from the rafters. Baskets of potatoes and braids of onions were stored neatly against one wall. On the table was a round of fresh cheese and a loaf of dark, heavy bread. To the starving men, it was a vision of paradise. The sisters gave them hot broth and bread. The men ate with a desperate, humbling hunger. They did not speak. They did not need to. The evidence of their own foolishness and the sisters' incredible foresight was all around them. When they had finished, Peterson looked at the sisters, his eyes filled with a shame that was deeper than the cold. "How?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "How did you do all this?" Mercy brought out their mother's book and laid it on the table. She opened it to a page that detailed how to build a winterproof animal shelter, how to store root vegetables in sand, how to calculate feed for a small flock through a 4-month winter. "We had a good teacher," she said. The men left with their arms full of smoked meat, cheese, and potatoes. They promised payment, but Prudence shook her head. "Just see that it gets to the families with children first," she said. It was not a request, but a command. The men returned to Providence like scouts from a new world. The town was stunned into silence, then into action. A sled was organized, and a party of men, including Mr. Finch, returned to the cave the next day. The mercantile owner, who had once mocked the sisters for buying chicken feed, now stood at the entrance to their home, humbled and astounded. He saw the healthy, bleating sheep in their clean pen. He saw the hen scratching in the hay. He saw a system so intelligent and resilient it defied everything he thought he knew about farming. He tried to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at the 2 young women, no longer orphans in his eyes, but leaders. "We were wrong," he finally managed to say. "We need your help." The sisters did not offer forgiveness, for they had never asked for an apology. They offered logistics. They organized the rationing of their supplies with a calm efficiency that shamed the town's panicked leadership. They knew exactly how much food they had, how long it would last, and how it should be distributed. They sent meat for the sick, milk and cheese for the children, and potatoes and turnips for everyone else. Each day, a sled would make the journey from the town to the cave, returning with life-sustaining provisions. The townspeople, who had once pitied the cave twins, now spoke their names with a kind of reverence. They were no longer outcasts. They were the providers. They had not just survived, they had prepared. They had not just endured, they had prevailed. Their useless inheritance of rock and shadow had become the town's salvation. The knowledge in their mother's book, once a private legacy, had become a public good. The sisters never went to the town. They stayed in their sanctuary, managing their small farm. They asked for nothing in return. But when the sled parties came, the men started bringing things. They brought tools they thought the sisters might need, a better axe, a new shovel, a set of wood-carving knives. The blacksmith sent a perfectly balanced skinning knife. The women of the town sent bolts of wool cloth and spools of thread, acknowledging a skill that far surpassed their own. These were not payments. They were offerings. They were gestures of respect. As the long winter wore on, the relationship between the town and the cave fundamentally changed. The townspeople began to understand that the sisters' strength was not a miracle. It was the result of relentless work, careful planning, and a deep, practical wisdom. They had not been lucky, they had been attentive. They had listened to the lessons of the earth, passed down in faded ink, while the rest of the town had been listening to the boasts of men like Mr. Finch. The harshest winter in a generation became a great teacher. It taught the town about the fragility of their prosperity and the foolishness of their pride. And it taught them that the most valuable resources were not the number of cattle in a field, but the quiet competence and resilient spirit of two young women who had built a life inside a mountain. When spring finally came, the thaw was slow and muddy. The world emerged from under the snow, scarred and changed. The carcasses of the cattle were a grim reminder of the winter's toll. But the town of Providence had survived. Not a single person had starved. On the first warm day of spring, a small procession, led by Mr. Finch and the Peterson family, made its way to the cave. They did not come to take food. They came to give thanks. Mr. Finch carried a small, healthy calf, a gift from his last surviving cow. Peterson's wife brought a basket of the first wild greens. They found Mercy and Prudence turning the soil in their garden beds, preparing for the spring planting. The sisters accepted the gifts with quiet grace. There were no grand speeches. There was only a shared understanding, a community reforged in the crucible of a deadly winter. The cave was no longer a place of exile. It was the heart of the community, a symbol of resilience. The earth had provided shelter, and two sisters, armed with their mother's knowledge, had provided the rest. Their inheritance, once deemed worthless, had proven to be the most valuable thing of all. Not the land itself, but the wisdom to live with it. An inheritance of ink and stone, written not on a page, but on the land itself.